To the US now, where the Supreme Court has heard arguments about whether Donald Trump is immune from prosecution for actions he took while president. The justices have been asked to consider whether any president should have full or partial immunity. The outcome will determine, among other things, whether Mr. Trump should face trial on charges he plotted to overturn his 2020 election defeat. With the latest from New York, here's CBS correspondent Jared Hill.
The Supreme Court yesterday in this case around the question of just how much immunity does former President Trump or any president of the U.S. for that matter have when it comes to criminal prosecution related to official acts that they are conducting as president. And what we heard from the justices is it seems as though the majority don't believe that there is this widespread blanket immunity for official acts as former President Trump has made a claim. Instead, it does seem as though there might be some sort of middle ground that they're focusing on. Now, with that, there potentially could be the possibility that if they rule in that way, that this case gets then struck down back to a lower court, which would snowball, delaying another bigger case here that's going on. This federal election interference case that former President Trump is facing that potentially could end up getting pushed beyond this November's election. Back to you.
Yeah, so take us through what we can expect today at the Supreme Court and also with Donald Trump's ongoing trial in New York.
Right. So the Supreme Court today is going to continue on with deciding how they're going to decide on that case. Meanwhile, we do have this hush money case happening in New York City. This one in New York State. This is not related really to that Supreme Court case, which kind of makes all of this a bit confusing. But this one, again, continues to go on. And the question around this is whether former President Trump was involved in this illegal scheme back before the 2016 election. If he was involved in this scheme to disclose hush money payments made to a woman claiming to have been in an affair with him. He says none of this happened. He says he didn't do anything wrong here. Today we're expecting for the former publisher of the National Enquirer to be back on the stand because he's someone who was integrally a part of all of these transactions that are said to have been made in order to sort of catch and kill stories that looked unfavorable to the former president or to, I guess, then candidate Trump at the time. And so he's going to be back on the stand. The defense, the former president's legal team, is going to be questioning him as they continue to try and poke holes in some of these arguments that the former president, again, orchestrated this scheme illegally to disclose some of those payments.
Jared Hill there. Well, Faith Gay is a former federal prosecutor. I asked her what she made of the arguments that have been put forward in the case at the Supreme Court so far.
The Supreme Court arguments are finished, and now it is up to the Supreme Court as to when they'll issue a decision. Yesterday's arguments did not suggest that any of the justices, except perhaps Amy Coney Barrett, were mindful of moving in any particular hurry. It may be that Trump actually wins in a certain sense by losing this case. As was mentioned, no one thinks that the president gets immunity for private acts. And then the debate is what is an official act for which he should receive immunity? Many of the conservative justices were very worried about the future, which is, can a new president come in and just vindictively prosecute his predecessor? The more progressive justices were worried about the fact that in this country, no one wants to have a king. They don't want a president to come into office and know that he can do anything and have immunity. So this debate is very robust, and there's a real chance that the case gets sent back to the lower court to define where is the line between official and unofficial. If that happens, in a sense, former President Trump wins because that delays his criminal case potentially till after the election.
Yeah, the justices were really very much aware of the decision-making here and how that could weigh in the future democracy of the country, weren't they?
Yeah, so they're very mindful of what a big decision this could be. Again, particularly the conservative justices were thinking, what is the precedent that is set? Will we end up seeing every former president indicted by his political predecessor or his political successor? But the justices did not seem to want to talk about the case in front of them, or they were thinking about the future, except for perhaps Justice Jackson and Justice Kagan and Justice Sotomayor. With respect to what will happen now, again, the key issue is whether this case will be so delayed by this forward-looking debate trying to get the line right between official acts and unofficial acts. And unofficial acts, of course, there will be no immunity. And whether that process drags on so much that there is no decision in the criminal trial below, no jury verdict, before the presidential election. And then if Trump wins, he can certainly end that prosecution himself.
Yeah, how much attention is this getting there in the US? How concerned are people about what could happen here?
I think it's getting a huge amount of attention. You know, interestingly, the last huge trials in the U.S., for example, the O.J. Simpson trial on our West Coast, were completely televised. And this country is very used to being able to get its legal news and being able to actually see it on TV. Here, interestingly, the New York state courts, where Trump is on trial right now, and the Supreme Court do not televise arguments. So all of it is a little bit behind closed doors, so to speak. They're public, but it's very much dependent on secondary perception, on great reporting by folks like you. But it's a little bit concerning, I think, in the U.S. that they're not able to actually see what is happening. Having said that, there is extreme interest, particularly in the Supreme Court argument. Lots of concern on the liberal or progressive side that many justices on the court seem to think that the president should be immune for almost any act associated with his office, and that a president could be elected knowing that once he gets into office, the criminal consequences are almost nil. So yes, huge interest here.
Faith Gay there. Well, Donald Trump's criminal trial around hush money payments continues today. This is the scene in New York outside Trump Tower while we wait for him to leave and head down to the courthouse. Of course, Trump has pleaded not guilty and denies falsifying business records to cover up a hush money payment to Stormy Daniels.